all over the world. They just sit there, massive stones, walls that don't fall, blocks that look like they were cut by machines we don't admit existed. They wait, patient, heavy, silent witnesses to a history no one remembers. We're talking stones that weigh as much as aircraft, foundations that shrug off earthquakes like they're nothing, blocks stacked together so tightly you can't slip a blade of grass between them, let alone a knife. And yet, the people who came later, the cultures we do know and study, barely say a word about them. No instruction manuals. No, here's how we did it. No bragging from kings about, look at my giant stone project. Nothing. What if these megaliths, the giant stone structures scattered across the planet, aren't random, isolated mysteries, but fingerprints? Fingerprints of civilization that vanished so completely. History doesn't even remember its name. You see these stones everywhere once you start looking. On the tops of mountains, hidden in jungle clearings, staring across desert plains, half buried under forests where no old text ever mentioned a temple or a wall. Different continents, different cultures, different languages. But the stones, they all share one uncomfortable trait. They do not fit the story we were taught about how human civilization developed. We learn a neat, simple progression. Small villages, towns, cities, stone tools, organized agriculture, pyramids, empires. Everything slowly, steadily, evolving step by step. Every generation, a little bit smarter. Every culture starting from scratch and building upward. But wherever the megaliths show up, that tidy story starts to fall apart. Site after site, one pattern keeps repeating. The oldest layers are the most advanced. At the bottom, blocks cut with mathematical precision. Surfaces that feel like they've been polished by industrial tools. Stone joints that have held tighter than any cement for thousands of years. On top of those foundations, later additions, cruder work, smaller stones, more gaps. History says skill should go the other way, but the stones disagree. Think about it. The Inca, the Romans, the later Egyptian dynasties, the Polynesian carvers, they all built on top of older stonework they couldn't match. They reused, repaired, copied, but they never fully reproduced that original level of mastery. If progress is always linear, why do the earliest stones often show the greatest skill? Stand at Sacsayhuaman in Peru, where blocks the size of buses locked together like a 3D jigsaw, puzzle modern engineers still argue about. Travel to Ollantaytambo, where pink granite monoliths show cut straighter than what you'd expect from an industrial saw. Cross the sea to Lebanon's Baalbek, where 3 foundation stones nearly 1,000 tons each sit aligned, so precisely it looks like someone used a laser level. Head up to Bolivia's high plateau and walk through Pumapunku, where H-shaped blocks and hard andesite show tolerances in fractions of millimeters, as if they came off a factory line. Go to Easter Island, to the little visited site of Anapu, and you'll find basalt walls fitted in the same tight, polygonal style as Andean fortresses, despite being separated by 6,000 miles of ocean. Even in Montana, at a place called Sage Wall, granite blocks echo that same distinctive interlocking polygon style. And then there's southern Siberia in the Shoria Mountains, where gigantic stone blocks, some estimated at over 3,000 tons, rise in step formations against a mountainside. Natural? Maybe. But the lines and corners look eerily familiar. Different continents, different cultures, but over and over, the same style, the same engineering fingerprints. Now here's the strangest part. We have no reliable ancient instructions on how this was done. No carved diagrams. No, this is how we cut and moved 1,000-ton stones. No old scroll titled, How to Build a Wall That Lasted Earthquakes, Volume 1. The same civilizations that recorded harvest yields, trade taxes, royal genealogies, religious rituals, star positions, even gossip about court politics. Somehow, just forgot to write down how they moved mountains. They wrote about everything, but not this. It starts to feel less like simple forgetting and more like the knowledge was already ancient, already lost by the time those writers lived. Archaeology tends to explain each site in isolation. The Inca used bronze chisels and manpower. The Romans used ramps and brute force. The Tiwanaku people slowly chipped away those perfect cuts. The Polynesians used trial and error and ropes. Each explanation is barely plausible on its own, but when you line them up side by side across thousands of miles and thousands of years, something doesn't add up. How many different cultures, working with primitive tools, accidentally hit the same level of engineering perfection in stone on massive scales with no clear experimentation trail and no written documentation? Over and over again, at what point does coincidence start to look like pattern? Maybe the megaliths aren't individual miracles. Maybe they're scattered pages from a single burned book, fragments of a story that once stretched across the globe. A story of knowledge that was shared, not isolated. A story that ended so violently. Only the hardest thing survived. Almost every culture has some old memory of cataclysm. Floods swallowing coastlines. Fire falling from the sky. Seas rising overnight. Ice retreating. Storms raging. Worlds ending. What if some of these megaliths were built for that? Not just as temples or fortresses, but as survivors. Foundations designed to endure disaster. Stone messages saying, "We were here. We knew how to do this. Don't assume you're the first." Because these stones do communicate. Not in letters or symbols, but in geometry. In the insane scale of their blocks. In joints that refuse to crack even after thousands of years. They hint that history isn't a neat climb from caveman to smartphone. It's more like a shattered mirror. Pieces of brilliance scattered through time, with huge missing chunks. Beneath the official timeline, the one we learn in school, there may be another story. One that whispers, we are not the first to master matter and design. We are not the first to push beyond what seemed possible. And in the quiet hours, late at night, when the world calms down and your mind finally has room to wander, you can almost feel it. Standing in front of those walls, under the stars, it's like the stones are alive in their own way. Their silence doesn't feel empty. It feels intentional, like they're waiting for someone curious enough to notice the pattern, to ask the forbidden question, what if the beginning of our story isn't actually the beginning? And if that question pulls at you, if you want to keep going down this path of forgotten engineering and quiet, ancient impossibilities, then this is where the journey truly starts. Not in Mesopotamia, not in Egypt, but in the stones themselves. So let's follow them. Let's go to the Andes. Above the city of Cusco, where the mountains hold up the sky, there's a fortress that shouldn't exist. Its walls don't just refuse to fall. They defy explanation. They're called Sacsayhuaman, often translated as the Royal Falcon. And they might be the first clear voice in this forgotten chorus. In the next part, we're going to walk right up to those walls and start looking closely at what the stones are actually telling us. High above Cusco, where the Andes bite into the sky and the air feels thin and electric, there's a place that doesn't behave like it belongs to our timeline. Sacsayhuaman. From the city below, it looks like a jagged crown, 3 huge zigzag lines of stone rising up the hillside. Most people see ruins, but when you get close, that word stops making sense. These are not ruins in the way we usually mean it. These are a riddle carved into a mountainside. Each block is enormous. Some are taller than you. Some weigh as much as 150 to 200 tons. And yet, they're not arranged like simple bricks stacked in rows. Every stone is a polygon, not 4 sides, but sometimes 8, 10, 12. Each one custom shaped to interlock perfectly with its neighbors, like a massive stone 3D puzzle. And the fit? Ridiculous. People love to say, you can't fit a sheet of paper between the stones. It's not just a cliche, it's true. Centuries of earthquakes, storms, and mountain weather, and those joints are still so tight it feels like the stones grew together. No mortar, no rebar, just rock on rock. Imagine trying to do that today. You'd probably start with laser scans, 3D modeling software, CNC cut templates, cranes capable of lifting 200 tons, a small army of engineers. Even then, getting this kind of precision on this scale would be a serious challenge. Now strip away steel tools, diesel engines, computer models. Give yourself bronze chisels, rope, and manpower. That's what we're told the builders had. Still sound reasonable? Because that's the official explanation. The Inca did it with bronze tools and time. Lots and lots of time. But the stones themselves tell a slightly different story. It's not just that they fit. It's that they look like they were designed together. Every surface anticipates another. Every angle distributes weight. The walls lean inward just enough to stabilize. The stones overlap in such a way that any movement is absorbed across multiple blocks. You can call it earthquake-resistant design. And you'd be right. But here's the weird part. Earthquake engineering isn't obvious. You don't just randomly stumble into the perfect anti-earthquake wall on your first try. You need repeated observation, long-term testing, some form of structural reasoning. Yet the Inca left us no engineering manuals, no design sketches on pottery, no carved reliefs of how we built Sacsayhuaman in 10 easy steps. Just the finished product, the walls themselves. Archaeologists talk about phases at Sacsayhuaman, and this is where things get really interesting. Look down at the base layers, the biggest blocks, the wildest polygon shapes, the tightest joints. These stones are the most advanced. Now look higher up, smaller stones, simpler shapes, less precision, more gaps. It's like watching a skill set fade over time. The further up the wall you go, the more the work starts to look like what we know the Inca could do elsewhere. Good, but not impossible. So the wall tells a kind of quiet story. The earliest builders were the most capable. Later builders did their best to imitate, as if the foundations were inherited, not invented. As if the Inca found something already ancient and said, whatever this is, it's incredible. We can't do that, but we can build on top of it. Walk along the wall, and you'll notice another strange detail. Little bumps, knobs. Some stones have round protrusions, like handles that were never shaved off. What are they? They don't add strength. They're not decorative in any obvious way. They're often placed where they'd be hard to use as grips. Some people suggest lifting points, pivot markers, leftovers from some unknown shaping process. What's more important is this. Those same knobs show up at other megalithic sites around the world. In Peru again, in Baalbek in Lebanon, at other Andean sites, even in far-off places where the style of stonework echoes the same strange signature. Whatever these knobs were, they look like the calling card of a very specific building tradition. Then there are the scoop marks. On some blocks, you'll see shallow, curved depressions that look like someone literally scooped stone out with a giant spoon. They don't look like chisel scars. They don't look like fractures. They look like the stone was soft for a moment, plastic, moldable, and then hardened again. And this isn't limestone or soft sandstone we're talking about. This is hard volcanic rock, andesite, basalt, materials that can wreck basic metal tools. Yet here they are, shaped into complex, interlocking forms with smooth surfaces and these odd scooped-out areas that feel more like claywork than carving. Stand there long enough, and a thought creeps in. Are we sure we understand what tools were being used here? Now, Sacsayhuaman isn't the only Peruvian site playing this game with our understanding. About 20 miles away, in the Sacred Valley, is another masterpiece, Ollantaytambo. It rises in terraces up a steep hillside, part fortress, part temple, part astronomical observatory. Most of it is impressive but familiar. Stone steps, retaining walls, terraces. But near the top, there's something different. The Temple of the Sun. 6 huge slabs of pink granite line up in a row. Each one weighs somewhere between 70 and 100 tons. And they're not local stone. You can trace them back to a quarry across the valley, more than 4 miles away, on the other side of a river. To get them here, you'd have to extract them from the quarry, move them downslope, cross the Urubamba River, then haul them up another mountain, with no wheels, no steel cables, no powered winches, just manpower and ropes. That's the story, anyway. And the stones themselves? Their cuts are razor straight. Their surfaces are smooth like they've been planed. Some show little drill-like holes bored with perfect consistency. Some exhibit groove marks that look eerily like saw cuts. Scattered along the ancient paths below, you find failures. half-shaped blocks abandoned mid-transport, stones left resting on top of other rocks, pieces showing the same clean cuts as the ones above, but never installed. It's as if whatever project these belonged to was suddenly interrupted. The usual explanation? The Spanish conquest disrupted the work. Reasonable until you remember, the Inca recorded a lot, even if not in writing as we know it, then in their quipus, the knotted cords that tracked labor, harvest, logistics. The Spanish chroniclers, who were obsessively curious, wrote down everything they could: road systems, storage depots, farming techniques, religious practices. They admired Inca masonry and described it in detail. But moving 70 to 100-ton granite blocks across a valley and up a mountainside, somehow nobody thought that was worth describing. No quipu explanation of the labor, no Spanish astonishment at the giant granite stones they're dragging. It's like everyone collectively decided not to talk about the most insane engineering trick on display. And that's the same pattern we saw at Sacsayhuaman. The more impossible the stonework, the less anyone seems to have remembered about how it was done. And across Peru, the same story repeats. The foundation stones are the biggest and most precise. The later additions get smaller and rougher, the reverse of what a slow, steady progress story would predict. If the Inca really developed this stone skill themselves, why does it decline instead of improve? Why don't we see rough attempts first and clean results later? Why is the best work always at the bottom and the weaker work stacked on top? One explanation is simple and uncomfortable. The Inca didn't start this. They inherited it. They came across foundations that were already ancient, already weathered, already beyond their ability to reproduce. So they did what we would probably do: respected them, reused them, incorporated them into their own culture, and quietly pretended they belonged. If that's true, then the stones we label Inca at sites like Sacsayhuaman and Ollantaytambo might actually be the remains of something far older, something that had already come and gone before the Inca ever built Cusco. And if Peru is just one chapter of that story, where does the trail lead next? To find out, we leave the Andes and cross half a world to a valley in Lebanon, where Rome built its grandest eastern temple on top of a platform even they couldn't explain. In the next part, we'll stand in front of Baalbek's 1,000-ton stones and ask the same question: who built the foundations everyone else borrowed? Leave the thin air of the Andes behind for a moment and imagine you're in a completely different world. Hot Mediterranean sun, dusty wind, cypress and cedar on the hillsides. You're standing in the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon, where, according to history, Rome built one of its greatest temple complexes. This place is called Baalbek. You walk up and see it. Towering columns, carved capitals, classical arches. It's very clearly Roman. Huge, beautiful, familiar in style. But that's just a costume. The real mystery is what the Romans built on top of, because beneath the elegant columns and ornate carvings sits a platform that absolutely should not exist. Let's go there. On the western side of the main temple platform, embedded in the podium wall, are 3 stones that deserve their own documentary. They're called the trilithon. Each one is about 19 to 20 meters long, around 65 feet, 4 meters high and 3 to 4 meters deep. Conservative estimates put them at 800 to 1,000 tons each. To put that in context, a fully loaded Boeing 747 is around 400 tons. Each stone is more than 2 jumbo jets. And they're not sitting at ground level. They're set neatly into a wall about 20 feet up. 3 megablocks in a row, side by side, aligned with silly precision. No mortar, no clamps, just gravity and perfection. Stand in front of them and ask yourself, how do you quarry a 1,000-ton block, move it from the quarry to the site, lift it 20 feet in the air, slide it into place with joints so tight you can't slip a finger in between? Even with modern cranes and machinery, that's not a casual weekend project. Now here's the really wild part. The Romans wrote everything down. We have texts on how they built roads, how they engineered aqueducts, how they designed cranes and pulleys, how they laid out cities. They love bragging about engineering feats. But when it comes to the trilithon, crickets, Not a single detailed description. No proud inscription. We, the great engineers of Rome, placed these world record stones. Nothing. That alone is suspicious. It gets stranger when you walk a short distance away to the ancient quarry. There, still attached to the bedrock, lies the famous Stone of the Pregnant Woman. It's even bigger, about 70 meters long, with weight estimates around 1,000 to 1,200 tons. Basically, what if we made a skyscraper-sized stone and didn't move it? And below that, in more recent excavations, they found another gigantic block, even larger. Estimates climb toward 1,500 to 1,600 tons. So here's the situation. At the site, 3,800 to 1,000 ton blocks are already in the wall. In the quarry, still attached, are even bigger stones, fully shaped, edges worked, clearly intended to be moved but never transported. Why carve stones that big if you can't move them? The standard explanation is, well, maybe the builders got overconfident. They miscalculated and had to abandon the largest pieces. Okay, maybe that happens once. But they successfully moved and placed multiple near 1,000 ton stones, then suddenly decided they couldn't handle the slightly bigger ones? So the same builders who pulled off the trilithon just forgot how heavy stone is? It doesn't quite track. A simpler interpretation. Whoever started this megalithic project could move those monsters. Whoever came later couldn't. At some point, the knowledge or capacity vanished. The quarry was inherited by people who no longer had the tech or the techniques to complete what had been started. Back at the platform, if you study the stonework carefully, you can see distinct layers of history. Bottom layer, the truly massive blocks, including the trilithon. Huge, mostly unadorned, just raw power and precision. Middle layers, smaller, more regular stones, impressive, but within what Roman cranes and manpower could reasonably manage. Top layers and temple structures, clearly Roman architecture, columns, decorated capitals, carved reliefs, inscriptions. It looks exactly like what you'd expect if A. Some unknown builders created a mega platform. B. That platform stood there long enough to become part of the landscape. C. Rome arrived much later and said, "Nice base. Let's put our temple on it." The Romans definitely left their mark all over the place. We have coins, inscriptions, carvings, dedications. But the deeper foundation, the truly outrageous stones, they're anonymous. Local legends try to fill the gap. Medieval stories say, giants built Baalbek before the flood. Or King Solomon had jinn, supernatural beings, build it for him. Or it was a pre-biblical city created by a race of beings stronger and older than ordinary humans. From a modern point of view, those are myths. But look at what the myths are saying. This place is older than memory. This place was built by someone not like us. This place predates the stories we know. Strip away the supernatural language, and the core message is the same everywhere we've looked so far. The foundations were already there. There's also a strange technical detail researchers have noticed. Localized magnetic anomalies. When you bring a compass near certain Baalbek stones, including some near the trilithon, the needle misbehaves. It spins. It won't settle on true north. Some blocks register unusual magnetic readings, while others right next to them don't. Limestone isn't normally strongly magnetic, so either the rock was exposed to intense heat, lightning, or some unusual process. Or something about how these stones were chosen or treated altered their magnetic properties. We don't know why. We just know these blocks weren't just lying around. Something happened to them that left an invisible signature we can still detect. There's more. Geologists have noted that the megalithic foundation stones show deeper weathering than the Roman structures above. Rounded edges, softer corners, signs of exposure under conditions that might match a wetter, older climate, possibly stretching back toward the end of the last ice age. You can't put an exact date on limestone like that just by looking at erosion, but you can say this. Whatever age the Roman temple is, the base it's sitting on looks older. So, once again, we're staring at the same pattern we saw in Peru. Massive, precise, older-looking stonework with no written explanation. Later, well-documented civilizations building on top of it and claiming the glory. Legends hinting that someone before us did the foundational part. A suspicious silence when it comes to describing the hardest engineering steps. The Inca did it at Sacsayhuaman. Rome did it at Baalbek. They both built on shoulders they pretended not to see. So now we have at least two giant dots on the map. Peru, Lebanon, two cultures with no connection in the official story, yet both sitting on inherited megalithic foundations that peak in precision at their oldest layers. Same pattern, same inversion of progress. And the pattern's about to get even stranger, because the Sacsayhuaman looks like impossibly advanced stone fitting, and Baalbek looks like impossibly advanced stone moving. The next stop looks like impossible stone machining, high up in Bolivia, at a place called Pumapunku. The stones don't just look carved, they look manufactured. In the next part, we'll go there to 12,800 feet above sea level, in the thin air of the Altiplano, and walk through what might be the most precise ancient stonework on the planet. Pumapunku doesn't whisper, it screams. Now let's climb. We're heading up to the Altiplano of Bolivia, a place so high the sky feels like it's pressing right down on you. 12,800 feet above sea level. Thin air, flat, wide plains, distant snow-capped peaks. And in the middle of all that, a scatter of stones that absolutely do not behave like they belong there. This place is called Pumapunku, the door of the Puma. What door it was, we don't know, but it definitely opens onto a problem. At first glance, Pumapunku looks like a field of broken blocks. It doesn't have towering walls like Sacsayhuaman or big standing columns like Baalbek. What it has is precision. Walk among the stones and start looking closely. Some blocks are cut so straight you'd swear they've been pushed through a modern machine shop. Drill holes run cleanly through hard stone, with consistent diameters from top to bottom. Surfaces are polished so flat they reflect light like glass in the right angle. Channels and grooves track along the stone in perfectly straight lines, turning crisp 90 degrees corners with no wobble, no overcutting. This is not good for its time. This is the kind of accuracy you'd expect from industrial fabrication. Now remember, we're not talking about sandstone garden ornaments. We're talking about andesite, a hard volcanic rock that can chew through metal tools. On the Mohs hardness scale, where talc is 1 and diamond is 10, andesite sits around 7 to 8. It's harder than most steel files. Try taking a soft metal chisel to that and see how long you last. Yet someone carved andesite here like it was workable material. And not just carved it, engineered it. One of Pumapunku's most famous features are the H-blocks. Huge andesite and sandstone pieces carved into intricate H shapes that are clearly meant to interlock with other blocks. They look like giant stone Lego pieces. These H-blocks have parallel faces that are almost perfectly flat, feature channels, L-shaped cuts, and recesses that repeat with uncanny consistency from block to block, include notches and ledges that appear to be designed for modular assembly, like components in a larger system. Run a straight edge along some of those grooves, and they barely deviate at all. Engineers who examine the stones with calipers and laser tools say the tolerances, how close the cuts are to their intended dimensions, can be measured in fractions of a millimeter. Even for modern stonework, that's impressive for a culture supposedly using stone hammers, copper or bronze tools, sand abrasion. That's something else entirely. Let's talk about the drill holes. Over and over, you see perfectly round holes bored into stone, aligned with each other through the block. Same diameter, same depth, smooth inner walls, no chipping, no ragged edges, no signs of pecking. Primitive drilling normally leaves roughness, peck marks, uneven walls, tiny impact scars. These holes look more like they were bored out by a rotating bit under steady pressure, like a core drill. Modern core drills often leave a spiral pattern or very clean cylindrical walls. At Pumapunku, some holes look eerily similar. Now, officially, this site is tied to the Tiwanaku culture, which flourished roughly between 500 and 1000 AD. Tiwanaku, just about a mile away, is an impressive site in its own right. Step pyramids, carved monoliths, ceremonial courtyards. But when you compare the stonework at Tiwanaku with Pumapunku, a strange contrast shows up. Tiwanaku's masonry is good, sophisticated, but recognizable. Stones fit well, but not seamlessly. Surfaces are shaped, but not glass flat. Carvings are detailed, but clearly the work of chisels and hand tools. It looks like what you'd expect from a skilled ancient culture. Pumapunku looks like something else. It's like walking out of a carved temple into an abandoned factory. The official explanation is that Pumapunku and Tiwanaku were both built by the same people in different phases as their culture evolved. But that raises some awkward questions. If the same culture could machine andesite level precision at Pumapunku, why didn't they use that same skill at Tiwanaku? Why are their highest ceremonial monuments built with comparatively normal stonework, while the separate platform area looks like it went through an industrial production line? It's like if you found a medieval village with one building made out of CNC milled titanium. You wouldn't just shrug and say, "Ah, yes, they were practicing." There's another detail that doesn't fit the slow, gradual progress story: the unfinished pieces. Scattered around Pumapunku are blocks frozen mid-process. A channel that runs halfway across the stone and suddenly stops. Drill holes started but not completed. Shallow. Clean dips and then nothing. A large slab cracked and abandoned, with one half smooth and the other still rough. These aren't early attempts that later get refined. They look like work that was interrupted mid-job. Like whoever was doing this just vanished or had to leave in a hurry. No gradual decline in quality. No visible learning curve. Just perfection, then silence. Once again, the same pattern. The most advanced work is the oldest phase. Later structures nearby don't match that level. No clear written explanation for how the best work was done. The people who lived there later, Tiwanaku, seem to have used Pumapunku, but that doesn't automatically mean they built it. And then come the stories. Andean oral traditions speak of a figure named Viracocha, often spelled Viracocha or Viracocha-like variants. A bearded, robed teacher who appears after a great cataclysm, after floods, darkness, and the destruction of a previous world. He emerges from Lake Titicaca, just miles from Pumapunku, and begins rebuilding civilization, teaching agriculture, teaching building, teaching astronomy, teaching people how to live again. He's not described as inventing knowledge from nothing. He's described as restoring what was lost. When he's done, he heads off across the sea, promising to return. Myth? Absolutely. But loaded myth. If there's even a grain of historical memory inside those stories, it suggests something powerful. The skills on display at Pumapunku might not have been a beginning, but a reboot. Someone or some group who still remember the ways of a previous age, trying to reestablish them after a catastrophe. It would explain why. The stonework looks like dropped-in high-tech. There's no visible learning phase. The techniques do not survive long into later, fully documented cultures. So, how were the stones actually shaped? This is where theories multiply. Some people suggest stone softening. Maybe they use plant-based chemicals, heat, or some unknown process to temporarily soften the rock, like making it clay-like before hardening again. Andean lore does mention plants that can melt stone. Scoop surfaces at places like Sacsayhuaman, and the weirdly smooth plastic-looking features of some Pumapunku stones feed into that idea. Others point to extreme, controlled heat. If you subjected areas of stone to very high temperatures, you might alter the surface enough to grind and polish more easily, or even partially vitrify it. Some stones at Pumapunku do show discolored patches and changes in texture that might be heat-related. Another idea is acoustics or resonance, using sound waves through drums, horns, or unknown devices to weaken stone at a molecular level, making it easier to work or even manipulate. We know sound can shatter glass and stress bridges. Could ancient builders have found some resonance-based trick for stone? We don't know. Of course, there's also the straightforward, unnerving option. Maybe they had advanced tools. Not necessarily laser cutters and steel factories, but something beyond what we think existed in that era. Very hard cutting tools. rotating drills with abrasive compounds, engineered templates, and measuring systems. If that's true, then those tools are gone, either corroded away, reused, or buried where we haven't looked. Whatever the answer, here's the uncomfortable truth. We cannot currently reproduce Pumapunku's exact stonework using only the tool set we officially assign to the Tiwanaku culture. And until we can, saying they did it with stone hammers in time is more a statement of faith than a fact. So now let's zoom out. We have Peru, massive interlocking polygonal blocks that defy simple carving explanations. Lebanon, 1,000-ton stones moved and set with precision, with no record of how. Bolivia, machine-level accuracy in insanely hard stone, with no clear technological path leading up to it. 3 points. 3 anchors on the globe, all whispering the same thing. The earliest stonework is the most advanced. We don't quite fit into the current story. But the pattern doesn't stop there, because if you follow the hints out across the Pacific, far beyond the coast of South America, you land on a tiny triangle of land in the middle of nowhere, where that same distinctive stone style shows up again, on a place so isolated it should have had no connection to any of this. Easter Island. In the next part, we'll leave the mountains behind and sail into the emptiest stretch of ocean on Earth, to a lonely platform of basalt blocks at a site called Vanapu, where the stones look like they're echoing the Andes from 2,300 miles away. From the high, cold plateau of Bolivia, let's trade altitude for isolation. Picture nothing but ocean. You sail west, away from South America. A day goes by, then another. No shore, no islands, just water and sky. After about 2,300 miles of open Pacific, a triangle of land finally breaks the horizon. Easter Island, a volcanic dot in the middle of nowhere, just 64 square miles. The very definition of remote. The nearest inhabited land is over 1,200 miles away. To the east, South America is a memory. To the west, Polynesia stretches across the ocean in scattered atolls and islands. If isolation created uniqueness, Easter Island should be its own self-contained world. And in many ways, it is. The iconic moai, the famous stone heads and torsos, exist nowhere else. They peer inland from the coasts, massive and mysterious, as if watching over a vanished population. But we're not going to the famous sites. We're going to a quieter spot on the southern shore, a place called Vanapu. Tourists don't rush here. It's not on every postcard. But if you care about patterns in stone, Vanapu is a bombshell, because tucked into this small, windswept platform is a wall that shouldn't be here. Not on this island. Not in this style. Not this far from South America. Walk up to the Ahu, the ceremonial stone platform that once supported Moai, and look at its foundation. You're going to get déjà vu. The lower courses of the wall are built from basalt blocks, dark volcanic stone, shaped and fitted with tight polygonal joints, multi-sided stones, curved edges, no mortar, joints so snug you'd expect them in an Andean fortress, not a Pacific island. If someone showed you a photo of this wall without context and said, "This is in Peru," you'd probably believe them. Same style, same philosophy, same "I dare you to fit a blade between these stones" attitude. This is not rough, improvised construction. It's deliberate, skilled, and incredibly familiar if you've been paying attention to Sacsayhuaman and the other Andean sites. Archaeologists notice the resemblance. Of course, the standard explanation is convergent evolution. Basically, two cultures facing similar problems, earthquakes, weather, access to basalt, independently came up with nearly identical construction methods. And sure, convergent evolution happens in nature all the time. Birds and bats both evolve flight. Octopus eyes and human eyes look similar despite very different origins. But here's the thing. Convergent evolution usually produces similar, not identical, results. Same function, different structure. Vanapu's wall doesn't just vaguely resemble Andean masonry. It looks like a copy. The tight, organic polygon shapes, the curved interfaces between stones, the way the blocks lock into each other in 3 dimensions. It reads like the same architectural handwriting. If this were just 1 or 2 stones, you could shrug and chalk it up to coincidence. But as we've seen across multiple continents, this style of masonry shows up again and again in highly specific ways. At some point, coincidence starts to feel like an excuse for not wanting to redraw the map. So how could knowledge have traveled this far? One word: ocean. For a long time, scholars treated the Pacific like a wall. Too big, too dangerous, too featureless for ancient people to cross deliberately. Then we started actually listening to Polynesians. Polynesian navigators crossed thousands of miles of ocean without compasses, GPS, or metal ships. They read the stars, the clouds, the color of the water, the way swells hit the hull. Modern experiments have confirmed what oral tradition always said. You can intentionally sail from island to island. Polynesians weren't drifting, they were voyaging. Genetic studies back this up. Polynesians carry ancestry from Southeast Asia. But there's also evidence suggesting they made contact with South America long before Europeans showed up. One of the clearest clues? A humble root vegetable, the sweet potato. It was domesticated in South America, but it appears throughout Polynesia before European contact. Even more suspicious, the name. In Quechua, spoken in the Andes, the sweet potato is called kumar. In many Polynesian languages, it's kamara or very close. Plants don't swim across oceans by themselves. Names don't accidentally match across to 000 plus miles. Someone carried that crop and its name across the Pacific. Once you accept that people were crossing back and forth, it's no longer crazy to imagine ideas crossing with them. If navigators can bring sweet potatoes, they can also bring stories, techniques, ways of working stone. That's one possibility. Another, more mysterious one: both South America and Easter Island received their stoneworking grammar from an older, shared source. Some maritime culture operating in the Pacific before sea levels rose and erased half the ancient coastlines. Because remember, when the last ice age ended, sea levels rose around 120 meters. Huge areas of what is now seafloor used to be dry land. Coastal plains, river deltas, island chains. If a seafaring niche thrived out there before the flood, their ports and cities might now be hundreds of feet underwater. All that would remain above sea level would be mountain sites, high islands, inland projects, places like the Andes, places like isolated volcanic islands, places like Easter Island. The island's own traditions add even more texture. The Rapa Nui people talk about 2 groups: the long ears and the short ears. The long ears are often described as the earlier group, the skilled builders, the ones who made the great platforms in Moai. The short ears, the later arrivals, eventually rebelled. In some versions of the story, they trapped the long ears in a pit filled with fire, wiping them out in a single catastrophic event. It's a myth, sure, told and retold, embellished, fragmented. But look past the drama and the symbolism, and you see the same core pattern we've heard before. There was a group before us. They were master builders. They vanished. This isn't just on Easter Island. All across Polynesia, there are legends of earlier little people or hidden builders. The Menehune in Hawaii, the Manahune/Manahuna in Tahiti and surrounding islands. They're always great stoneworkers, responsible for impressive old structures. Gone by the time the current inhabitants arrive. Different islands, different names, same story. The greatest builders came first. Then something happened. Then others came later and inherited. Back on Easter Island, the Moai themselves raise more questions. Many of them weigh 30, 50, even 80 tons. They were carved at a central quarry, Reino Raraku, and then somehow moved miles across rugged terrain to the coasts. The usual explanation is carve statue, tip it down, slide it on logs or sledges, drag it with huge teams of people. Rapa Nui tradition tells a different story. The ancestors say the Moai walked, not rolled, not dragged, walked, brought to life through mana, spiritual energy, guided by chants and ritual. Now, we can interpret that 2 ways. 1. Purely supernatural, literal walking statues. Or 2. As a mythologized version of a clever physical technique. Modern experiments have shown that you can walk a moai upright by tying ropes to both sides, rocking it side to side, advancing its base forward like a fridge being shuffled across a floor. It's still a lot of work, but it's much more efficient than dragging. So the legends might be preserving a real transportation method, just framed in religious language. And that's kind of the point. Even when knowledge is slipping away, people wrap it in story, ritual, and myth to keep at least the shape of it alive. The wall at Vanapu then becomes more than just a footnote. It's a signature. It tells us the Pacific wasn't empty. Isolation is exaggerated. Ideas traveled a lot. And if the same advanced stone-fitting style appears in the Andes, in Easter Island, in other scattered places, then we're not looking at isolated miracles. We're looking at the fingerprints of a shared tradition. Someone sometime knew how to do this really well, and that knowledge was taught, carried, partially remembered, and eventually lost. We've now got 4 strong anchors: Peru, Lebanon, Bolivia, Easter Island, all different cultures, different time frames, same strange architectural language. You'd think the pattern would stop there, that it would stay mostly around the Mediterranean, South America, and a few Pacific outposts. But it doesn't, because there are places far from any of these established centers where the same style quietly surfaces again. Places like Montana. In the next part, we'll go somewhere that absolutely should have nothing to do with any of this. The granite ridges of southwestern Montana, where a formation known as Sage Wall looks suspiciously like someone tried to build a Peruvian-style megalith in the Rocky Mountains. From a tiny island in the middle of the Pacific, let's jump to a place that, on paper, should have no connection to any of this. The Rocky Mountains, southwestern Montana. No ancient empires. No colossal stone temples. No famous megalithic niche. Just pine forests, high ridges, snow in the winter, granite everywhere. And yet, tucked into those mountains, there's something that shouldn't be there. Locals call it Sage Wall. At first glance, it looks like a long, jagged stone ridge running along the mountainside, roughly following the contour of the hill at around 8,000 feet. You might mistake it for a normal rock outcrop, a natural spine of granite exposed by weather and time. But walk closer, and the shape of it starts to feel wrong. Too straight, too organized, too deliberate. The wall stretches for roughly a mile, rising in places up to around 10 to 15 feet. The stones that make it up aren't random boulders. Many of them are polygonal blocks, multi-sided pieces that fit together with surprising neatness. They're not as super tight as Sacsayhuaman or Vanapu, but the look is familiar. Angled faces nesting into each other. Stones that seem selected and placed rather than just fallen. A stacking pattern that feels more like masonry than chaos. The biggest blocks form the base, with smaller pieces filling in and locking the gaps above. Like someone understood the principles of weight distribution and stability. You're looking at granite, tough, stubborn stone, not something you casually nudge into place. And yet it doesn't quite behave like a purely natural formation. Geology can absolutely produce dramatic structures, columnar joints, fracture patterns, cliffs and ledges that look architectural. Freeze-thaw cycles, tectonic stress, and erosion can carve rock into impressive shapes. Skeptics say Sage Wall is just that, a convenient illusion. But there are details that make that explanation feel incomplete. For one thing, some of the blocks appear to have worked contact surfaces. Where 2 stones meet, you see areas that look ground or smooth, as if someone nudged and adjusted the fit instead of leaving it entirely to chance. Then there are the knobs. If you've been following the thread from Peru and Baalbek, your eyes are trained for them now. On several stones at Sage Wall, little protrusions stick out from the surface, rounded bumps of granite, sitting near edges and corners. They don't seem to support anything. They're not part of a natural fracture pattern. They're just there. And they look very much like the knobs you see on stones at Sacsayhuaman, Ollantay Tambo, and even Baalbek. Why would granite blocks on a Montana ridge have the same odd little features as massive megaliths in Peru and Lebanon? Natural erosion doesn't usually produce small, neatly placed nubs at structurally important points. Construction traditions do. Then there's the weirdest part, the magnetism. Bring a compass close to certain stones in the wall, and the needle starts misbehaving. It swings. It spins. It refuses to settle properly on north. Geologists know granite can contain magnetite and other iron-bearing minerals that create small magnetic anomalies. But at Sage Wall, the effect seems selective. Some blocks deflect compass needles strongly. Adjacent blocks hardly affect them at all, as if certain stones were subjected to a process or chosen for a property that altered their magnetic character. This echoes what's observed at Baalbek, where specific megaliths exhibit unusual magnetic behavior, and at other megalithic sites where selective magnetization shows up in the largest or most important stones. Lightning strikes? Maybe. Heat exposure? Possibly. Some unknown technique involving magnetic fields or high temperature. We don't know, but it's one more echo of a pattern we've seen before. Now, to be fair, there is a strong argument on the other side. Geologists will tell you granite fractures along planes of weakness. It can break into blocky shapes. Gravity and erosion can rearrange those blocks downslope. What looks like a wall might simply be bedrock cracking along natural joints, pieces slumping and locking against each other, freeze-thaw cycles widening gaps and exaggerating outlines. From that perspective, Sage Wall is an optical illusion, our pattern-hungry brains turning natural geology into man-made architecture. And sometimes, yes, we do see castles and cliffs and faces and clouds. But Sage Wall pushes that explanation to its limit, because it's not just one thing. It's the length of the formation, the way it follows the ridgeline, the block-like organization, the polygonal fits, the familiar knobs, the magnetic anomalies. One or two of those could be coincidence. All of them together, it starts to feel like we're looking at something that's not entirely natural. There's another silence to consider. Montana's native peoples, the Crow, Blackfeet, Salish, and others, have rich oral traditions. They tell stories of the land, of specific valleys and peaks, of spirits linked to certain places. Indigenous oral history is incredibly detailed, often preserving knowledge about landscapes, migration, and sacred sites for thousands of years. But as far as we know, there aren't well-established, widely recorded stories naming Sage Wall as a human creation. If a recent culture had built something this monumental, some echo of that effort would likely survive. A legend, a taboo, a place where the ancestors shaped stone story. The lack of such stories suggests one of two things. The wall is natural, and people never regarded it as a major human-made site. Or it predates the cultures whose stories we have, built by people whose identities, languages, and myths have been completely erased. And keep in mind, the first humans in North America go back at least 13,000 years, probably more. That's enough time for entire cultures to rise, build, decline, and disappear, leaving only traces in stone and scattered artifacts. If Sage Wall is natural, then it's an eerie parallel to Andean and Levantine masonry, geometry by accident. If it's partially artificial, humans enhancing a natural formation, then it implies something more radical, that the same architectural grammar we've seen in Peru and Easter Island might once have extended into North America. Polygonal fitting, knobs, magnetized stones, high, remote locations. Either way, Sage Wall becomes a problem for the idea that megalithic architecture was only a Mediterranean and Andes club, because now we've got South America, the Middle East, the Pacific, North America, all showing variations of the same strange pattern. And we're not done yet. The pattern extends even farther, into a place almost no one associates with ancient stonework, southern Siberia. In the Shoria Mountains, on the other side of the world, something sits on a mountainside that makes even Baalbek's trilithon look modest. It's called Gornaya Shoria. And if Sage Wall feels like a scaled-down echo of Peru, Gornaya Shoria feels like someone hit maximum size on megalithic construction. Some of its blocks are estimated, very cautiously, to weigh over 3,000 tons. That's 3 times Baalbek's biggest stones. 15 times the weight of Sacsayhuaman's heaviest blocks. Heavy enough that even modern construction would struggle to do anything meaningful with them. Yet they appear block-like, stacked in terrace-like patterns, with flat planes and edges that sometimes meet in straight seams. Natural? Artificial? Some strange mix of both? Just like Sage Wall, the debate is intense. But if even a portion of what we're seeing at Gornea Shoria turns out to have been shaped or arranged by human hands, then the scale and reach of ancient stoneworking ability explodes way beyond a neat map drawn in textbooks. So we follow the trail, from Peru's interlocking giants, to Lebanon's 1,000-ton foundation stones, to Bolivia's machined andesite, to Easter Island's Andean-style walls, to Montana's suspicious granite ridge, and now into the frozen mountains of Siberia. In the next part, we'll climb that icy slope and stand in front of stones so large they make everything else we've seen feel almost modest. If Sacsayhuaman and Baalbek hint at a lost capability, Gornea Shoria asks the next question: how big were they really willing or able to go? Most creation myths start with a voice. A god speaks and reality obeys. Let there be light. Let there be sky and earth. Instant results. No mistakes. No prototypes. The Sumerians? They tell a very different story. Their creation myths don't sound like divine magic tricks. They sound almost like lab notes. One of the most important is the Atrahasis epic, written down around 1800 BCE, but based on even older Sumerian material. It doesn't begin with humans. It starts with gods doing manual labor. The younger gods, the Ijiji, are digging canals, dredging rivers, maintaining the infrastructure of the world for thousands of years. Eventually, they snap, they burn their tools, surround the house of the chief god Enlil, and basically go on strike. We've had enough. We will not do this work forever. The elder gods panic. They need the work done, but they can't force divine beings into eternal hard labor. So Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water, comes up with a plan. Let us create a new kind of worker. Humans, not for worship, not for love, not as a moral experiment. For labor, to dig, carry, maintain, build. But here's where their story goes sideways compared to most mythologies. The creation of humans is not instant, and it doesn't go smoothly. Enki and the birth goddess Nintu, also called Ninmah or Balili, gather clay from the subterranean waters, the Apsu. Then they mix that clay with something else, the blood of a slain god. That divine essence, the texts say, carries Tiyu, intelligence, understanding, consciousness. In other words, the clay gives a body. The god's blood gives a mind. They place the mixture into the wombs of birth goddesses and wait. 14 beings are shaped. 7 males, 7 females. Already, this doesn't sound like poof, humans exist. It sounds like gather materials, combine ingredients, use a biological vessel, wait for the result. A process, not a spell. Another text, the Enki and Ninmah myth, goes even further and describes a failure phase. Ninmah starts creating humans from clay, but it doesn't go smoothly. She makes a being who can control their bladder, instead of erasing the attempt or pretending it didn't happen. The story says Enki assigns this person a role where that doesn't matter. Maybe as someone confined to house, cared for by others. She makes another who can't stand properly. Enki gives them a place among the king's attendants. Another, blind. Another, with paralyzed hands. Each time, the gods don't destroy the defective human. They repurpose them. They adapt the role to the body. On the surface, it's a myth about accepting disability and recognizing value in every person. But structurally, it reads eerily like iteration, attempt, outcome, analysis, adjustment, try again. Ninmah shapes, Enki evaluates, they move forward. This is not how creation is usually described. There's no, and then the perfect human was made in one go. Instead, we tried this. It didn't quite work. So we changed the plan. It sounds less like theology and more like someone trying to preserve the memory of a process they barely understand with the only tools they have. Story and symbol. The ingredients are specific. Clay from the earth. essence from a higher being, wombs as incubation vessels, a sequence of attempts before stability. If you strip away the divine names and just look at the structure, you get physical material, something like code or pattern added in. Biological development, trial and error. No, this is not modern genetics. The Sumerians had no concept of DNA. But if people in a pre-scientific age had somehow inherited knowledge, or at least stories, about a deliberate process behind human origins, this is exactly how it might look once translated into myth. The wise ones mixed earth and essence. They made many attempts. At first, the results were flawed. Then, eventually, something stable emerged. We read it now as the gods created man, but the text itself doesn't say. He spoke and they appeared. It walks you through steps. And notice something else. Humans in these stories are not an accident. They're not an afterthought. They're a solution. The gods need workers. They design a being to fill that role. That implies intent, planning, purpose. And once humans are made, they don't start as wild creatures in the forest. They begin in a context of organized labor, digging canals, maintaining temples, feeding the gods through offerings. Only later do the myths layer in themes of worship, morality, rebellion. Underneath it all is this unsettling core. We were made because someone needed us to work. Now ask yourself this. If you're a scribe in 2000 BCE, preserving traditions that might already be over 1,000 years old, how do you write down something your ancestors whispered in more clinical terms? You don't have words for genetic engineering or selective breeding or bioengineering or modification of existing hominids. All you have are clay, blood, wombs, gods. So you use the vocabulary you have. The gods mixed earth and divine essence. They made mistakes. They corrected them. We're not used to reading myth this way. We're trained to see these stories as fantasy, morality plays, spiritual allegories. But Sumerian myths are often oddly procedural. They give steps, recipes, sequences. Their creation account doesn't feel like someone trying to explain why life exists. It feels like someone trying not to forget how it started, according to memories passed down from distant days. Whether those memories are literally accurate or not is one question, but it's hard to ignore this pattern. They talk about knowledge being given. They describe creation as a process. They see themselves as restorers, not originators, which brings us to the beings they consistently name as the givers of that knowledge. The ones they say taught them everything from farming to writing to temple architecture. The Sumerians had a word for them, Anunnaki, and in the next part, we'll look at who those beings were supposed to be, who they reminded other cultures of, and why their role in Sumerian memory might be less gods in the sky and more survivors from a world that ended, trying to pass on what they knew before it was lost forever. Let's pause for a second and look at the map we've drawn together. Peru, Lebanon, Bolivia, Easter Island, Montana, Siberia, 6 sites, 3 continents, tens of thousands of miles apart. And yet the stones all seem to be telling variations of the same story. Polygonal masonry, multi-sided blocks that lock like 3D puzzles. Gigantic one-piece stones where smaller blocks would have been easier. Joints so tight they laugh at time, weather, and earthquakes. Mystery knobs. Heat scars. Magnetic weirdness. Precision that doesn't quite fit the tools we're told existed. If one place did this, you'd call a marvel. If 2 did, you'd raise an eyebrow. 6? Now you're in pattern territory. And here's the part that keeps repeating like a glitch in reality. The oldest layer is always the most advanced. At Sacsayhuaman and Ollantaytambo. Giant, crazy precise blocks at the bottom. Smaller, looser, masonry piled on top. At Baalbek, megastones in the hidden foundation. Normal Roman engineering above. At Pumapunku, machine-looking andesite in the core. More conventional construction in the surrounding complexes. At Vinapu, Andean-style fitted basalt at the base. Simpler, rougher additions around it. At Sage Wall and Gornea Shoria, the most impossible stonework appears at the deepest or most central parts. Later, or natural forces scramble what's left. It's backwards. If history were a smooth ramp of progress, the rough stuff should be at the bottom, and things should get better as time goes on. Instead, it looks like someone started at the top, and each age that followed tried and failed to climb back up to that level. And then there's the silence. Think about who we're dealing with. The Romans wrote books about how to build bridges. The Inca tracked labor and logistics with intricate quipus. The Tiwanaku carved iconography into monoliths and ceremonial spaces. The Rapa Nui encoded their world in chants and genealogies. These were not people who ignored important things. They recorded harvests, wars, taxes, rituals, lineages, sky events. But somehow they all forgot to mention how to move a 1,000-ton stone, how to drill perfect cylinders through andesite, how to fit multi-ton blocks so tightly you can't slide a razor blade between them. Not one clear technical manual. Not one, here's how we did this inscription. Just stone, as if the people we can see in the record inherited these structures rather than created them, as if they arrived late to the party, found the furniture already there, and just started living with it. So if these megaliths are leftovers, what happened to the culture that made them? To answer that, we have to zoom out even further, not on human history, but on the planet itself. Because around 12,000 years ago, the world went through something big. The last ice age ended. Sounds simple, but what that actually means is brutal. Massive ice sheets over North America and Eurasia, some over a mile thick, started melting. Huge freshwater lakes held back by ice dams suddenly broke free. Glacial melt poured into the oceans in huge pulses. Sea levels rose on the order of 100 plus meters. That's about a 30 to 40-story building in vertical water. Imagine every coastline you know. Then imagine the ocean climbing up it higher and higher, swallowing everything built near the shore. River valleys become bays. Low plains become seafloor. Islands vanish completely. Most humans, then as now, would have lived near water, which means if there were coastal cities before that flood, if there were ports, harbors, dense trade hubs, they're now underwater, not under 3 meters, under hundreds of feet of salt water and sediment. Add another layer. Evidence many researchers point to the so-called Younger Dryas boundary. In certain layers of sediment dating to roughly 12,800 years ago, there are spikes in platinum, tiny spherical particles formed in intense heat, nanodiamonds. Some interpret this as signs of comet impacts or atmospheric detonations. Did something hit the ice sheets? Did it trigger or accelerate the meltdown? Did it cause continent-scale wildfires and climate chaos? The debate is intense, but one thing isn't. Whatever happened at the end of the last ice age, it was rough on life here. Climate flipped. Big animals went extinct. Human populations went through bottlenecks. Whole ecosystems changed. Now take that global turbulence and overlay it on the stories almost every culture tells. Mesopotamian texts speak of a flood that wiped out nearly everyone except one warned survivor. The Hebrew Bible repeats the same pattern with Noah. Hindu tradition has Manu and the Great Deluge. Greek myth talks about Deucalion and Pyrrhus surviving Zeus's flood. Andean legends remember Viracocha emerging after world-destroying waters. Pacific Islanders recall lands that sank beneath the waves. Indigenous traditions worldwide talk about the world before, destroyed by water, fire, or both. If these were isolated stories, we could call them coincidences or archetypes. But when geology and myth line up, when you see real sea level rise and real climate chaos in the scientific record, and cultures worldwide remembering a time when the world drowned, you have to at least consider that these aren't just metaphors. They might be memories. Now imagine this. Before the floods, there was a seafaring niche. Not Atlantis with crystal lasers. Not sci-fi cities and glass domes. Just humans like us, but living earlier, longer, smarter than we give them credit for. They hugged the coast. Because coasts are where life is good. Abundant food, easy trade, predictable routes. Over thousands of years, they master navigation, stoneworking, maybe some clever physics we've forgotten. They spread that knowledge around, into the Andes, into the Levant, into islands now sunk, across what we now call the Pacific and Atlantic. Then the world changes. Ice melts, seas rise, storms rage, impacts or volcanism add fire to water. Their ports go under. Their coastal cities vanish. Their population plunges. The survivors flee inland and uphill, to mountains, to plateaus, to high island ridges, the places where we now find Sacsayhuaman, Baalbek's platform, Pumapunku, the high Andes sites, odd relic walls on islands and peaks. If you knew all this was coming, if you knew your lowland world wouldn't make it, what would you do? You wouldn't bother with fragile stuff. Papyrus burns. Wood rots. Clay tablets dissolve or shatter. You'd pick the one medium that lasts at time and weather. Stone. You'd build at elevations less likely to drown. You'd over-engineer everything. You'd make it so big and so precise that even if your language died and your books scattered, the stones themselves would shout, "We were advanced. We understood. We were here." Those megaliths start to look different when you think of them that way. Not temples to gods, but messages. Not "we worship this king," but "we reached this level." Geometry as a language carved into the bones of the planet. And that leads to the idea some researchers call the mother culture hypothesis. Not a single global empire with one flag and one alphabet, but a shared technological and architectural tradition, spread by seafarers, adapted locally, then smashed apart by catastrophe. After the collapse, survivors cling to fragments. How to grow certain crops, how to watch the stars, how to shape stone so earthquakes can't bring it down. Over generations, the deeper reasoning erodes. The rituals remain. The style remains. The understanding fades. Later cultures inherit the megaliths like hand-me-down clothes 2 sizes too big. They wear them proudly. They claim them. But they can't tailor anything new to match. So what were the tools? What were the tricks? We don't know. But the stones suggest possibilities. Something that could soften or restructure stone surfaces, chemical, thermal, or vibrational. Heat control intense enough to partially melt or vitrify rock. Advanced abrasive or cutting techniques. Maybe even some use of magnetism or resonance we haven't yet rediscovered. Are these guesses? Yes, but they're guesses guided by physical evidence. Scoop marks, glassy surfaces, magnetic anomalies, millimetric precision in hostile materials. The point isn't to say, here's exactly what they did. The point is to admit, what we've allowed for an official story does not explain everything we're seeing. And if that's true, if these stones really are the afterimage of a long-gone niche, then they're not just curiosities, they're warnings. Because if they were built as survivor monuments, as "we were here," messages from people who watched their world unravel, then the real question isn't just, what did they know? It's, what do they see happen? In the next part, we'll step into that thought experiment fully. If you knew your civilization was about to be erased, by water, by fire, by time, what would you choose to leave behind? And as we ask that, we'll have to turn the question back on ourselves. When our turn comes, what survives of us? Step back for a moment and see it all at once. Peru, Lebanon, Bolivia, Easter Island, Montana, Siberia, 6 sites, 3 continents, separated by oceans, deserts, and thousands of miles, and yet laid side by side, the stones read like pages torn from the same book. Look at the signatures. Polygonal masonry, multi-sided blocks fitted together like 3D puzzle pieces at Sacsayhuaman, Ollantaytambo, Vinapu, and Sage Wall. Megaton stones, blocks weighing hundreds of thousands of tons at Baalbek and Gornea Shoria, far beyond the comfortable edge of ancient engineering, as we describe it. Mystery knobs, those odd protrusions at Sacsayhuaman, Ollantaytambo, Baalbek, and Sage Wall, sitting in structurally meaningful places, serving no clear purpose in the final design. Scoop marks and soft stone textures, curved depressions and strangely smooth zones in Andean sites that look less like chisel work and more like stone that behave, however briefly, like clay. Laser straight cuts and drill holes in Pumapunku and Ollantaytambo, with millimetric tolerances and clean cylinder walls in stone harder than most modern tool steel. Magnetic anomalies. Stones at Baalbek and Sage Wall that scramble compass needles while their neighbors sit quietly, as those specific blocks were altered or chosen for their magnetic properties. Heat-affected rock. Surfaces at Puma Punku and Gornea Shoria that show discoloration or textural change, hinting at controlled, intense thermal exposure. These are not vague resemblances like they all use stone. These are technical fingerprints. Details so specific, so unusual, and yet so repeatedly linked that the idea of completely independent invention starts to feel like wishful thinking. How many times can polygonal fitting, mystery knobs, megastones, precise drilling, and magnetic oddities show up together on different continents before we stop calling it coincidence? Add to that the timeline problem. The most massive, most precise, most baffling work is always sitting at the bottom of the stack. The Inca build neat, but simpler walls on top of megalithic foundations. The Romans raised gorgeous temples on a platform they clearly didn't shape. The Tiwanaku culture surrounds Pumapunku with stonework that doesn't come close to matching its accuracy. Later Rapa Nui masonry sits on top of older, tighter Vinapa blocks. In every case, it's as though history is trying to climb back up to something it once knew how to do and never quite gets there. And then the written record goes quiet. The Egyptians boasted about quarrying obelisks. The Romans brag about roads and aqueducts. The Inca tracked labor and logistics with knotted cords. Even small kingdoms love to carve their achievements into stone. But for these superstructures, the largest blocks, the tightest joints, the hardest stones, no one claims credit. No step-by-step explanation. No, we invented this. No engineering treatise titled On the Moving of a 1,000-Ton Block. Instead, you get myth, legend, and vague stories of those who came before. That's strange. Cultures almost never forget to brag, unless they can't. Unless they're standing in the shadow of work they inherited, not work they did. So we're left with an uncomfortable, but increasingly inescapable conclusion. The megaliths are not isolated puzzles. They're fragments of a single larger story. Not 6 separate miracles, but 6 surviving chapters of a book that was mostly burned. What might that book have been about? Put the pieces together. A niche or a network of niches capable of cutting and assembling gigantic stones, shaping incredibly hard rock with absurd precision, possibly manipulating stone through heat, chemistry, or resonance. A world where oceans were lower, coastlines stretched farther, and now submerged plains supported thriving coastal cultures. A global upheaval, ice melting, seas rising, maybe impacts from above that destroyed most lowland settlements and forced survivors to retreat to high ground. A long, slow forgetting where technique decayed into style and style decayed into myth. In that light, the megaliths stopped looking like random temples to forgotten gods and start looking like survivor architecture. If you knew your world was ending, really ending, how would you send a message forward? Paper? Gone. Digital archives? Gone in decades. Wood? Rot. Clay tablets? Break, dissolve, erode, get buried. You'd have to think long term. You'd pick the one material that outlives almost everything. Stone. And not just any stone. Hard stone that shrugs off weather. Huge stone that can't be casually moved or repurposed. Stone place where water won't easily swallow it. Mountain ridges, plateaus, high coastal cliffs. Then you'd encode a message, not in words, but an impossibility. Not build this shape, but reach this level. You'd use scale to signal power, precision to signal knowledge, endurance to signal intention. A 1,000-ton block set 20 feet above the ground doesn't need an inscription. It says all by itself. Whoever did this understood things you don't. A wall of interlocking polygons that stands unfazed after countless earthquakes says, we solve problems you're still fighting. Machine-perfect cuts in andesite say, we had tools and methods you no longer have a name for. Taken this way, the megaliths are less like ruins and more like test patterns. Can you do this yet? If yes, you've caught up. If no, you're still behind where we were. Then the flood comes, the ice breaks, the climate whiplashes, whole coastlines shift, ports are swallowed, harbors vanish, knowledge centers, libraries, schools, observatories drown or burn or crumble. What survives? Stories, carried in memory, reshaped into myth, fragments of technology, like half-remembered recipes. And stone, always stone. Generations pass. The people who come after remember that the old stones are special, but not exactly why. They weave tales to explain them. Giants, gods, culture bringers like Viracocha, Onzi-Apkallu, Quetzalcoatl, sage kings and sky teachers. They retell the same core concepts over and over. A time before, a disaster, survivors, rebuilding. They might still use the structures, turning platforms into temples, aligning rituals with forgotten alignments, reusing foundations for new buildings. But the blueprint, the how, fades. And that's where we come in. Thousands of years later, walking among these stones, we're doing what those builders probably hoped someone would eventually do. We're asking questions. We're noticing the pattern. We're feeling that itch that says, something's missing from the story you were taught. So what might that missing piece be? Maybe an advanced niche. Not advanced like flying cars in sci-fi cities, but advanced where it counts. In how they understood materials. In how they harnessed natural forces. In how they adapted to a changing planet. Maybe they knew how to use chemistry to soften or reconstitute stone, thermal control to stress and shape rock at high temperatures, acoustic resonance to fracture or move heavy blocks using vibrations, magnetism or other field effects in ways we haven't explored fully, geopolymers, forms of liquid stone poured and cured into exact forms. We don't have to know exactly what they did to admit that something like this could explain what we see. And until we can replicate their feats using only the tools and methods we comfortably assign to those ancient cultures, they did it with stone hammers and patience isn't really an answer. It's a placeholder, a way of marking the gap between what exists and what we're willing to allow. The stones are telling us that gap is real, and they're asking a bigger question. If someone came before us, if they built big, thought big, and still got swept off the board by planetary change, what does that say about us? About our own cities, clinging to coastlines, about our own belief that our story is the first and final chapter, about our assumption that knowledge only moves upward, never sideways, never backward. In the next part, we'll shift the camera once more, from them to us. We'll look at our own civilization through the same lens. If everything we built disappeared, what traces would we really leave behind after 10, 000, 50, 000, 100,000 years? And when we compare those traces to what we see in the deep past, we might find that the megaliths aren't just memories of a lost world. They're a mirror. Let's flip the lens. For a while now, we've been staring backward, trying to make sense of impossible stones and silent foundations. We've asked what kind of niche could have built them, what kind of catastrophe could have erased them, and what scraps of their work might still be sitting in plain sight. Now, turn that same question on us. If our civilization ended tomorrow, what will remain in 100,000 years? Imagine, just for a moment, that something happens. Doesn't matter what. A cascade of climate disasters, a pandemic we can't stop, a nuclear exchange, an AI gone rogue, a quiet fertility collapse. Pick your apocalypse. The result is the same. Cities empty. Lights go out. No one maintains anything anymore. What happens next? In a decade, skyscraper windows start to fall. Steel begins to rust in the damp and salt. Roads crack as roots pry them apart. Underground pipes burst and flood basements. In a century, most roofs have collapsed. Bridges sag and fall into their rivers. Wooden houses are gone, rotted back into soil. Suburbs vanish under forests, vines, and dust. In 1,000 years, the tallest buildings are ruins, skeletal frames poking through greenery. Asphalt is buried under layers of dirt and fallen plants. Our cars and trains, flakes of rust, scattered like iron-rich gravel. Concrete is splitting, breaking, spalling apart under freeze and thaw. In 10,000 years, Glaciers may have advanced and retreated again. River systems will have shifted, eroding some regions, burying others. Coastlines will have moved, especially as sea levels keep inching up. Our cities will be mounds. Not skylines, not grids, just odd hills. In 100,000 years, stand where New York once stood. There might be a forest, or tundra, or desert, or the ocean. The skyscrapers? Gone. The bridges? Gone. The subways? Filled in, collapsed, compacted into rock. Maybe, just maybe, a few weirdly straight lines of stone or rebar fossils hint that something artificial was once here. But nothing like the Manhattan we know. If a future archaeologist, human or not, dug down through those layers, what would they actually find? Not glass towers. Not entire cars sitting in parking lots. Not laptops and pristine desks. They'd find broken concrete, weird alloys, plastic fragments, rusted metal, and a few heavily altered mineral layers. Our libraries full of books? Gone. Our cloud servers and hard drives? Gone. Our fiber networks and satellites? Gone. The whole digital empire we treat as permanent is, geologically speaking, smoke in the wind. Within a few hundred years without maintenance, our data is dust. So where we leave marks that might last 100,000 years? In the same place the megalith builders did, the planet itself. We've already begun writing in the Earth's own archive. Just not with stone blocks. We're writing with chemistry. Take a future scientist 100,000 years from now, drilling a core out of layered rock. As they move down to the strata, they see normal variations in sediment, normal rises and falls in CO2, natural patterns of climate and biology. Then they hit our layer. Suddenly, a sharp spike in greenhouse gases, a sudden change in carbon isotopes, too much light carbon from burning fossil fuels, ash and soot from global-scale fires, metals and alloys in concentrations nature doesn't normally produce, strange molecules, plastics, pesticides, industrial compounds, locked into sediments. If they look closely, they might also find remnants of nuclear tests, artificial radionuclides like plutonium-239 and cesium-137, microplastics embedded in what used to be ocean floors. A mass extinction signature as species disappear and new ones appear in the fossil record. They might not know what we called ourselves or how we organized our societies or what language we spoke, but they would know this. At some point, long after the last ice age, but long before their present, someone did something drastic. Someone triggered an event so intense it left a permanent chemical scar in the rock. Just like we look back at the boundary that killed the dinosaurs, a thin line laced with iridium and shock quartz. They'd look at our boundary, the human layer, the technogenic horizon, the Anthropocene, if that name survives. Our legacy won't be skyscrapers. It will be altered climate patterns, redistributed sediments, weird molecules that don't break down easily, isotopic traces of our energy habits. Sound familiar? Because that's exactly the line of thinking some scientists used when they asked, if an industrial civilization had existed on Earth millions of years ago, would we be able to tell? It's a thought experiment sometimes called the Silurian hypothesis, named jokingly after a race of ancient reptilians in Doctor Who. Strip away the sci-fi, and the core question is serious. If there was a niche before ours, one that used energy, reshaped landscapes, maybe even had industry, would the geological record show it? And more uncomfortably, is it possible we simply haven't looked at the right signals in the right way yet? Because here's the humbling part. We've drilled some cores. We've sampled some sediments. We've mapped some of the seafloor. But Earth's deep time archive is massive, and we've only skimmed thin slices of it. Most of the ocean floor is younger than 200 million years. It constantly gets recycled by plate tectonics. Most ancient surfaces have been buried, eroded, or subducted. We might be seeing only scattered pages from a very thick book, and just as we might leave behind, a brief, intense carbon spike, some weird isotope ratios, a scattering of synthetic compounds, a previous niche living 100,000 or 1 million or 10 million years ago might have done the same. By now, Any physical ruins will be long gone. But a sharp oddity in chemistry, a strange blip in the rock record, that could still be there. We might already have drilled past it, logged it, and filed it under. Unusual anomaly, probably natural. Because until you entertain the idea that someone could have done this before, you never even think to ask, is this artificial? That's the same blindness we bring to the megaliths. We look at 1,000-ton stones and say, nature can't do this, so this we'll call human. But we look at strange chemical layers and say, nature can only do this. No way it could be anything else. The truth is, we're biased both ways. We underestimate what nature can carve in stone, and we underestimate what intelligence, ours or anyone else's, might leave behind as its most enduring footprint. So, tie this back to the walls. Think of those ancient builders, whoever they were. Maybe they understood the same thing we're just beginning to grasp, that in deep time, almost everything disappears. Cities crumble, roads vanish, statues fall, stories distort, languages die. Only a few categories of things stand a chance. The biggest stones, the hardest rocks, the deepest layers, the chemical scars. So they chose their medium accordingly. They spoke in granite and andesite, in 1,000-ton blocks and impossible joints. We are speaking in CO2 and plastic, in uranium and synthetic chemicals. Two civilizations, maybe separated by tens of thousands of years, both leaving messages in the same silent archive. Theirs, we mastered matter. We survived something big. Ours, we burned a lot of carbon. Fast. If someone were to compare the two megalithic leftovers and our chemical fingerprints, they might see a pattern. Earth has hosted intelligence before. More than once. More than we think. And intelligence doesn't guarantee permanence. It barely guarantees survival. All of this leads to a final, sobering perspective. We might not be special in the way we like to think. We might not be the first to reach this level. Just the latest. A chapter, not the whole book. In the next part, we'll begin to land the story. We'll gather up everything we've seen. The stones, the floods, the myths, the genes, the chemistry, and ask what it means for how we see ourselves now. Not as a peak of history, but as one wave in a long series of rises and falls. And then we'll ask the hardest question of all, knowing how fragile memory is. What, if anything, do we want to send forward into the dark? So here we are. We walked the terraces of the Andes, stood in the shadow of Baalbek's foundation stones, run our fingers along the machined edges of Pumapunku, listened to the whisper of Anapu's wall, climbed toward Sage Wall's granite seam, and stared up at Gornea Shoria's mountain-sized blocks. We watched the same signatures appear again and again. Polygonal masonry, impossibly huge stones, tight joints, strange knobs, heat scars, magnetic anomalies, and an eerie silence in the written record. We followed flood myths, ice sheets, sea level rise, and possible impact events. We've watched remembered worlds drown and rebuilt worlds begin. Now the question isn't really, can we prove an advanced lost civilization existed? The question is, what changes if we admit it might have? Because for most of us, history has been taught like a staircase. You start with simple stone tools and small bands of hunter-gatherers. You go up a step, farming. Another, villages. Another, cities. Then writing, empires, industry, technology, us. Very orderly, very clean, very flattering. We are presented as the top step, the highest point. Everything before us leads to us. But that staircase doesn't match what the stones show us. The megaliths suggest something more like waves. A niche rises. It accumulates knowledge. It adapts. It experiments. It builds. And then something bigger than it, climate shift, cosmic debris, planetary feedback, knocks it down. Not to zero. Just back far enough that the next wave has to rebuild from scraps. Some ideas survive as myths. Some techniques survive as tradition. Some structures survive as foundations. But the full pattern, the complete blueprint, that gets scattered. So what we call the beginning of civilization might actually just be the beginning of the latest wave. Evidence suggests Homo sapiens have been around for at least 300,000 years. Writing? 5,000 or so. That means 95% of our time on this planet is invisible to written history. Think about how much we've done in the last 200 years. Now imagine 200,000 years of trial and error, migration and settlement, disaster and recovery. Is it really that crazy to think that at least once, maybe more than once, humans got further than we currently allow in the official script? Not flying cars in cyberspace, maybe, but further in ways that matter for survival. Learning to work stone in ways we struggle to replicate. Mastering navigation across vast oceans. Understanding the sky deeply enough to encode calendars and architecture. Building structures that shrug off earthquakes for thousands of years. And then came the floods, the fires, the reset. The megaliths began to look less like random monuments and more like place markers. You weren't the first. You probably won't be the last. You are in a cycle, not at the finish line. That's a humbling shift. It changes the way we frame ourselves. Instead of, we are the pinnacle of human history, it becomes, we are the current expression of something much older. Instead of, we inherited a blank world and built everything from scratch. It becomes, we inherited more than we realize and lost more than we'll ever know. It doesn't mean we throw out all of archaeology or decide that every rock someone points to on the internet is proof of Atlantis. It means we hold two truths at once. The evidence we do have is real, important, and hard-earned. The evidence we don't have may be vast, and its absence doesn't automatically mean nothing was there. Absence of proof is not proof of absence, especially when we know 300 feet of ocean can hide entire cities. Ice can grind landscapes down to bedrock and erase everything on them. Time can bury, crack, and recycle almost anything that isn't massive, hardened, and perfectly placed. The megaliths are the exceptions. They're the rare bits that were built big enough, high enough, strong enough, to survive long enough for us to scratch our heads in front of them. They are, in a sense, bookmarks poking out a book that mostly burned. You don't need to know every missing page to realize the story was longer. You just need to notice that the bookmarks aren't at the beginning. They're somewhere in the middle. And that's where we are too. Somewhere in the middle. Not the dawn of human intelligence. Not the end game. Just one more wave rolling up the shore, carried by momentum we didn't start and will not finish. That can be unsettling. It means we're not as unique as we like to think. We might not be the first to split the atom of stonework, tame oceans, or misunderstand how fragile our situation is. But there's also a strange comfort in it. If others came before us, then we are not alone in our striving. We're not alone in our mistakes. And we're not alone in wanting what we build to outlast us. The people who lifted those blocks, who carved those joints, who planned those platforms, they were like us. They argued. They loved. They worried about their children. They looked at the sky and wondered what it all meant. They watched their world change. And they decided to send something forward. Not a book, not a movie, not a data file. A statement in stone. We reached this level. We saw what was coming. We tried not to be completely erased. They couldn't control everything. Neither can we. But they could choose how loudly they'd speak to the future. And in that sense, they succeeded. Because here we are, thousands of years later, still listening. Still walking between their stones. Still feeling the tug of a question they embedded in the bedrock. How far back does this story really go? In the final part, we'll bring this all the way home. We'll stop asking only what they left behind and turn the question toward ourselves. If we are just one more wave, what, if anything, do we want to send crashing into the future? What trace of us should outlast forgetting? Imagine this. Night. You're standing alone by a wall of stone older than your language, older than your country, older than any book you've ever read. The stars are out. The air is still. And in that silence, the stones feel less like ruins and more like company. You are not the first person to stand here and wonder. Someone else did. Thousands of years ago. Maybe tens of thousands. They looked up at the same sky. Different constellations, same cold distance. They felt the same smallness, the same urgency. They knew two things at once. Their world was fragile. Their work did not have to be. So they lifted blocks heavier than locomotives. They carved joints that would outlast mountain storms. They placed stone on stone with such intention that we're still here, straining to decode it. Not their names, not their myths, not their politics. Their message. We were not simple. We were not at the beginning. We were already in the middle of a long story when everything changed. Across the world, other groups did the same. On mountain ridges, on high plateaus, on lonely islands in the open sea. They built in a way that said, this is not for us. This is for whoever comes after forgetting. And then the forgetting came. Ice melted. Seas rose. Skies darkened. Worlds drowned. Generations passed. Knowledge shrank into legend. Legend shrank into myth. Myth shrank into fragments. By the time history begins in our textbooks, most of the earlier story is already gone. All that remains are a few strange structures that don't fit the timeline, a web of flood myths that sound a little too familiar, fragments of oral tradition that insist there were worlds before this one, genetic echoes of lineages that merged with ours and then vanished, and stones, silent, massive, unreasonable stones. We arrive much later, walking among these leftovers, and we do what humans always do. We tell ourselves we're the first to build big, first to think deeply, first to really count. It's a comforting story, but the stones don't agree. They don't scream. They don't preach. They just don't go away. Earthquakes hammer them. Rain scour them. Empires rise and fall around them. And still those joints stay tight. Still those blocks sit where someone put them long before our current version of civilization had a name. So maybe instead of arguing with them, we listen. Maybe we let them adjust our perspective. Because whether or not you believe in a fully developed lost civilization, whether you picture an ancient maritime niche spreading knowledge across a lower sea level world, or just scattered pockets of advanced craftsmanship, the core message is the same. Humans have been more capable for longer than we've been taught. And the story of civilization is probably not a neat arrow going up. It's more like a heartbeat, rising, falling, rising again. Each rise thinks it's the first. Each fall thinks it's the last. Neither is right. We are not the beginning. We are not the end. We are a wave. That realization can shift something subtle but profound. It softens the arrogance that says, we are the pinnacle. It sharpens the responsibility that says, we are stewards of something very old. We inherited more than we realize. We inherited not only genes and tools and crops and words, but also mistakes, overconfidence, short-term thinking, the belief that the world will always bend for us because it has so far. The builders of those megaliths probably believed that too, until one day, the sea came closer than it ever had, or the sky glowed in ways it never had, and the old assumption snapped. They didn't have a choice about the catastrophe. We might not either. But like them, we do have a choice about what we send forward. Their choice was stone. They built things that say, we were here. We understood some of the rules. We try to leave you a hint. Our choice so far has been data centers, plastic, atmospheric chemistry, and a thin radioactive dusting across the globe. A future intelligence, human or otherwise, might never find one of our crumbling skyscrapers, but they will find a layer rich in plastics and synthetic compounds, a sharp CO2 spike, weird isotopes from our nuclear experiments, and a rapid change in the fossil record. They'll know someone was here. They just won't know who we thought we were, unless we choose, intentionally, to leave something else. Not just in stone, though maybe that too, but in how we live now, in the choices we make knowing we are not unique, not permanent, not guaranteed. What if we stopped behaving like the finale and started acting like one careful link in a chain? What if instead of burning through everything as fast as possible, we try to pass forward stability, resilience, and wisdom? Because the real question behind all the mystery isn't, did Atlantis exist? Or were there lasers in the Stone Age? It's, are we any better at listening to the warnings than they were? We can decode isotopes. We can read ice cores. We can model sea level rise centuries in advance. We don't have to rely only on myth and intuition. We know how quickly things can change. We know how fragile our systems are. We know that memory can be wiped so thoroughly that only stone remains. And still, we live like the wave will never break. The megaliths disagree. They stand there generation after generation, outlasting creeds and flags and languages, whispering a quieter, older truth. This has all happened before. Not exactly like this, but close enough. You are not exempt. So maybe the real meaning of these stones isn't about proving a lost civilization beyond any doubt. Maybe it's about letting the possibility humble us, letting it crack the illusion of uniqueness, letting it remind us that we're temporary, we're powerful, and we're responsible for what we do with that combination. We may never know exactly who carved those blocks or how, or under what sky their builders stood. We may argue forever about dates and tools and methods. But on some level, none of that is the final point. The point is this: we are not the first beings on this planet to look at time and feel small. We are not the first to reach for permanence and leave something stubborn behind. We are not the first to live at the edge of forces bigger than ourselves. But we are the ones alive right now, the ones with a chance to decide what kind of mark we want to leave. A scar? A warning? An invitation? Or maybe, if we're lucky, a bridge. Something that tells whoever comes after, we were here. We tried to learn. We tried to remember. We tried to leave you a world that wasn't entirely broken. The ancient stones did their part. They survived. They got our attention. What we do with that attention, that part of the story is still being written.